On the night of March 15, 1971, First Lieutenant Lionel Pace of the 1st Cavalry Division was asleep in his quarters at Fire Base Pace in Tay Ninh Province when a fragmentation grenade rolled through the door. He survived. The soldier who threw it did not intend to miss. He threw another one 3 nights later. Pace survived that one too, by luck and by the particular grace of a grenade that bounced off a cot frame at the wrong angle. The soldier who threw both grenades was a member of Pace's own platoon, a man Pace had trained with, eaten with, shared the particular misery of Vietnam with. The Army investigated. The investigation went nowhere. Pace requested a transfer. It was denied. He spent the remaining months of his tour sleeping in different locations every night, moving like a man who understood that the enemy he needed to survive was wearing the same uniform he was. The word fragging comes from fragmentation grenade, the weapon of choice for soldiers who wanted to kill their officers and leave no fingerprints. A grenade produces no ballistic evidence. In the chaos of a combat zone, a grenade detonation could be attributed to enemy action, to accident, to the infinite and ungovernable violence of a war zone. It was the perfect weapon for a perfect crime, and between 1969 and 1972, the United States Army and Marine Corps recorded 900 confirmed or suspected fragging incidents. In those incidents, 99 officers and NCOs were killed, and more than 500 were wounded. These are the confirmed numbers. The actual numbers were certainly higher, because the perfect crime was frequently perfect. To understand why American soldiers began killing their officers in significant numbers starting in 1969, you have to understand what the American military in Vietnam looked like in 1969. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 had broken something in the American public's relationship with the war. The official narrative of progress, of light at the end of the tunnel, of a war being won, had been exposed as fiction by a nationwide enemy offensive that reached the walls of the American embassy in Saigon. Lyndon Johnson did not seek re-election. Richard Nixon was elected on a promise to end the war with honor. What honor meant in practice was Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, and the withdrawal of American troops. Vietnamization told every American soldier in Vietnam something specific and devastating. The war was going to end. America was leaving, which meant that dying in Vietnam now, in 1969, in 1970, in 1971, was not dying to win. It was dying to fill time while the politicians arranged the exit. This knowledge corroded unit cohesion from the inside. The soldiers who arrived in Vietnam in 1969 were not the volunteers of 1965. The Army's manpower system, processing 500,000 troops through Southeast Asia, had consumed the willing and was now running on the drafted, the reluctant, and the increasingly radicalized. The counterculture that was transforming American civilian society in the late 1960s had followed the soldiers into the field. Marijuana was available everywhere. Heroin arrived in significant quantities after 1970. By 1971, Army medical officers estimated that 51% of soldiers in Vietnam had used marijuana, and 43% had tried heroin. A military force in which half the members are using narcotics is not a military force prepared to maintain the kind of discipline and hierarchy that keeps officers safe from their own men. The racial tensions that were fracturing American society also fracturing the American military. The Civil Rights Movement, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, the documented reality that black soldiers were dying in disproportionate numbers while fighting for a country that had not extended its full protections to them, all of this arrived in Vietnam in the consciousness of black soldiers who were increasingly unwilling to accept the authority of a white officer corps that they had reason to distrust. Racial incidents in rear areas became common. In September 1968, a race riot at Long Binh Jail, the Army's detention facility in Vietnam, resulted in the death of one white soldier and injuries to dozens. The fragging statistics reflected racial dynamics. Not all fragging was racial in motivation, but the racial composition of who threw grenades at whom was a data point the Army tracked carefully and declined to publicize. The specific officer behaviors that triggered fragging incidents were documented in the Army's own investigations with uncomfortable specificity. The most common trigger was what soldiers called a glory hunter, an officer who pursued aggressive patrols, unnecessary contact with the enemy, and body counts for the purpose of career advancement rather than tactical necessity. In a war where the official metric of success was enemy killed, officers were rewarded for aggressiveness and penalized for caution. The soldiers who paid for that aggressiveness with their lives made their own calculation. A grenade through a tent flap was, from a certain perspective, rational self-preservation. Captain Eugene Dandridge of the 101st Airborne was known among his men as someone who pushed patrols into areas the soldiers considered unnecessarily dangerous. In the spring of 1970, a fragmentation grenade was rolled into his hooch. Dandridge was not killed. He was transferred within 48 hours, which was the Army's standard response to a fragging that did not result in death. Move the officer, investigate minimally, file the incident. The underlying conditions that had produced the grenade remained entirely unchanged. The bounty system that developed within some units was perhaps the most disturbing manifestation of the epidemic. In units with particularly aggressive or brutal officers, enlisted men began pooling money to offer rewards for killing. A bounty of $50, $100, sometimes $1,000 collected from enlisted men would be offered to whoever killed a specific officer or NCO. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division documented these bounty pools in dozens of units. The existence of a bounty was itself a message, a demonstration of collective will that sometimes functioned as a warning. Some officers who learned that a bounty had been placed on them modified their behavior. Some requested transfers, some did not change their behavior and were killed. Staff Sergeant Harold Haskett of the 25th Infantry Division was fragged in his bunker in April 1971 by soldiers who had reportedly contributed to a bounty pool because of his treatment of enlisted men during base camp duties. Haskett survived with severe injuries. The investigation identified a suspect but could not obtain sufficient witness cooperation to prosecute. The suspect was transferred to a different unit. This outcome, investigation without prosecution, was the norm rather than the exception. The Army prosecuted approximately 80 soldiers for fragging between 1969 and 1972. With 900 confirmed or suspected incidents and 99 deaths, the prosecution rate was approximately 9%. The impunity was structural. Soldiers knew that even if suspected, the likelihood of conviction was low. Witnesses in combat units did not testify against each other. The code of silence that governed enlisted life was absolute and enforced by social pressure that no officer's authority could override. The Marine Corps had its own fragging epidemic that ran parallel to the Army's and in some respects exceeded it in intensity. The Marines maintained a higher operational tempo in their areas of operation and a more rigid hierarchy, conditions that in combination with the same drug problems, racial tensions, and war weariness produced the same explosive results. In the 1st Marine Division's area of operations in 1969 and 1970, fragging incidents occurred at a rate that division commanders described in internal communications as a crisis of command authority. The word crisis appeared in those communications repeatedly. It was accurate. Commandant of the Marine Corps General Leonard Chapman told Congress in 1971 that fragging was the most serious disciplinary problem the Corps had faced since World War II. He did not tell Congress that the Corps' own investigations had found that a significant percentage of fragging victims had been identified by their own men as the direct cause of the attack through their leadership behavior. He did not tell Congress that the investigation process had been deliberately kept low profile to avoid the press attention that detailed fragging statistics would generate. The hearings produced expressions of concern and no significant institutional change. The Army's response to the fragging epidemic was administrative rather than transformative. Regulations were changed to restrict the availability of grenades to soldiers in rear areas, where most fraggings occurred. Fragmentation grenades in base camps were supposed to be stored in unit arms rooms rather than carried by individual soldiers. This reduced the weapon of choice's availability but did not eliminate it. Soldiers substituted claymore mines, pipe bombs constructed from military explosives, and in some cases conventional gunfire, which was harder to disguise but not impossible in a combat zone. The underlying conditions that produced the violence, drug abuse, racial tension, the knowledge that the war was ending and dying in it, now was meaningless. The specific brutality of officers who treated their men as instruments of career advancement. None of these were addressed by storing grenades differently. The fragging epidemic ended not because the Army solved it, but because the Army left Vietnam. As American troop numbers declined after 1971, the social pressure cooker that had produced the epidemic depressurized. The soldiers who remained were more likely to be volunteers or short-timers close to rotation. The conditions that had generated the worst incidents, Large numbers of involuntary draftees concentrated in rear areas with access to drugs and weapons and nothing to do but wait for their rotation date gradually ceased to exist as the war wound down. The officers who survived fragging attempts rarely spoke publicly about their experiences. The institutional shame was enormous. An officer who had been the target of a grenade thrown by his own men had been, by definition, rejected by the people he commanded. That rejection, whatever its justification, carried a stigma that military culture had no framework to process. Some transferred to administrative roles and completed their careers quietly. Some left the military. A few wrote about their experiences decades later in memoirs that received limited attention. The 99 officers and NCOs who were killed in fragging incidents are not listed separately on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Their names are on the wall mixed among 58,279 others, with no notation of how they died or who killed them. They are counted among the war's dead without specification. The men who killed them are, in most cases, alive today, never prosecuted, their actions part of the private history they carry but do not discuss. The fragging epidemic was the Vietnam War turning on itself. It was the logical endpoint of sending men to fight a war that their government had already decided to lose, under officers whose careers depended on body counts, in conditions of racism and drug abuse and despair that the military's command structure had created and then could not control. The grenade that rolled through Lionel Pace's door in March 1971 was not an aberration. It was a symptom, and the disease it diagnosed was not a failure of individual soldiers, it was a failure of everything above them. If you want to understand more about the Vietnam War's internal collapse, there is a video on screen right now that goes deeper. Subscribe. These are the stories that make you understand why wars end the way they do.